Here is the overview you need. So let me first give you the quick answer, and then I'll give you the long answer. I'll dig a little deeper. The quick answer is, if you have a dependent who is earning income, great news. You can still claim them as a dependent as long as other dependent rules still apply. Your dependent's earned income does not go on your return on your Form 1040. Filing tax returns for your children is easy, very easy in that respect. If you are the dependent in question, you might be asking, do I file taxes if I am a dependent? Even if you are a child, filing a tax return might be necessary depending on your income and circumstances. In short, you will want to file taxes. You want to file your own dependent tax return to claim your own W-2 income if you meet the filing requirements and you had income tax withholding, you are owed a refund. So this is really important. Now, if you are claimed as a dependent, you must file if your income is more than the standard deduction allowed for dependents. So if your earned income is more than $12,000 to $13,000, which is the standard deduction for a single filer, your earned income, example investments, is more than $1,050, and your gross income is more than the greater of $1,100, or you earn income up to $11,850 plus $350. What I'm trying to say here is that you have to really understand. So if you have to file a tax return for your dependent, it's not just about the income earned by the dependent himself or herself, but it's also your income. And the other question is, are you filing single? Are you filing as a head of household? Or are you filing as married, filing jointly, or married, filing separately? So your tax filing status also plays an important role when it comes to whether or not you have to file a tax return for your dependent. And one thing I want to say clearly also is that when we talk about dependents, the IRS has rules. They do have criteria whereby they actually judge whether or not somebody qualifies as a dependent. Actually, the language they use is qualifying dependents. So when you say, do I have to file a tax return for my dependent? The better question should be, do I have to file a tax return for my qualifying dependent? Because that dependent still needs to qualify. He still has to meet the rules, that the criteria the IRS has put in place. So I gave you the short answer. Now let me give you the long answer. By the way, welcome back to the channel. It's really a pleasure to have you here. So we're having a conversation around whether or not you should file a tax return for your dependent. So let's talk about that. I want to give you the long answer, and this will take probably 4 to 5 minutes. Now, here is let's talk about the income info for filing as a dependent on someone else's return. So depending on your age, marital status, and income, you might have to file taxes even if you are dependent on someone else's return. So when we talk about income, we are speaking about income that falls into three main categories. So we have earned income, unearned income, and gross income. So earned income basically usually comes from 9-to-5 jobs or other similar activities. So you're speaking about salaries, wages, tips, professional fees, taxable scholarships, and fellowship grants. When we talk about unearned income, we're speaking about taxable interest, ordinary dividends, capital gain distributions, unemployment compensation, taxable Social Security benefits, pensions, and annuities. And then we talk about gross income. That's the total of your earned and unearned income. It's really important to understand when we talk about income, it's not just about the cash flows that you receive. And please be very careful about record keeping. Okay, and so because the thing is that the IRS will track all your sources of income, because they receive information from your employers, for example, your business partners, for example, from your brokerage accounts, for example. So the IRS keeps track of all this information, and everything is tracked at your Social Security level. So everything is, so for example, if the IRS receives over last year that you actually made $100,000 from different sources, and you file your return, and there is a dichotomy, there is a gap between what the IRS receives and what you are telling them you actually made. Let's say you said you made 90 grand or 85 grand. That gap could be a problem for you. This is how people get in trouble, because they're not able to keep track of all their sources of income. So it is your responsibility. to actually keep tab on all your sources of income. And it's just a lot better to do it continually throughout the year than actually just waiting at the end of the year and saying, I'm just going to prepare my taxes right now. Don't wait for tax season to start preparing your taxes. You can actually you can be proactive and do things all year long. So when should you file a return as a dependent? And so let's talk about that. So the thing here is that you have to understand. And by the way, today's topic, we're having a conversation about, do I have to file a tax return for my dependent? So when should you file a return as a dependent? Well, even if you are filing as a dependent or a dependent child, you must file a return if you are single or married dependent under age 65 with unearned income more than $1,100, earned income more than $12,200, gross income more than $1,100, or earned income up to $12,000 to $13,000 plus $350, gross income of at least $5, and you had a spouse who filed a separate return with an itemized deductions if married. So that's the first option here. One thing I want to say here is that when we talk about you're a single or married dependent under age 65, you have to understand that, going back to what I said earlier, your record keeping is really important. And the IRS will pay attention to your record keeping ability. Make sure that you are, because see, the thing is, if you ever get audited, or if they send you a notice, if they want to inquire about something, you need to be able to back up whatever you're putting on your tax return. Okay, so that's the first option. If you are a single dependent over age 65 with unearned income more than $2,750 or $4,400 if over 65 and blind. If you have earned income more than $13,000 to $14,000 or $16,000 if over 65 and blind. Gross income more than the larger of $2,750 or $4,400 if over 65 and blind. You earn income up to $12,000 plus $2,000 or $36.50 if over 65 and blind. So this is actually the second condition whereby you must file a tax return. The third condition, the third scenario rather, where you must file a tax return is if you are married dependent over age 65 with unearned income more than $2,400 or $3,700 if over 65 and blind, earned income more than $14,000 or $15,000 if over 65 and blind, gross income of at least $5, and you had a spouse who filed a separate return and itemized deductions. Gross income more than the larger of $2,400 or $3,700 if over 65 and blind, and your earned income up to $12,000 plus $1,650 or $2,950 if over 65 and blind. And one thing I want to say here is that even if you're not required to file a return, you might want to file a return anyway as a dependent. Filing a tax return for your child or other dependents will allow them to get a refund on any tax withheld. So it's always good, always good. So let's take this one by one, okay? So who can I claim as a dependent on my tax return? So I want to break down the IRS requirements for correctly adding dependents on your tax return, okay? So first and foremost, a dependent is someone you support. Very important to remember that. You must have provided at least half of the person's total support for the year. I'm talking about food, shelter, clothing. If your adult daughter, for example, lived with you but provided at least half of her own support, you probably cannot claim her as a dependent. So this is really important to see the distinction here. And one thing I want to say here is that claiming dependents no longer gets you a personal exemption, as the personal exemption was eliminated in favor of a much higher standard deduction. So when we talk about dependent claiming, let's go back to the origins. Let's look at the basic rules here. What are the basic rules for claiming a dependent? So dependents are usually, but not always, a child or other relative. And qualifying children and qualifying relatives have their own additional requirements, but all dependents must meet these requirements. So there's actually 3 of them that the IRS pays attention to. So please pay attention to here also. So dependents can have their own tax returns and even be married, but they must not have filed a joint tax return for the year unless it's just to claim a refund. And they must be a U.S. citizen, U.S. national, resident, alien, or a resident of Canada or Mexico. They must have a taxpayer identification number. That's usually a social security number, but if the child does not qualify for one, it can be an individual taxpayer identification number, an ITIN, or an adoption taxpayer identification number, ATIN. Also, if you are considered dependent yourself, you cannot claim another person as a dependent. So this makes sense because if you are considered a head of household, you cannot be somebody else's a dependent, because when you claim somebody as a dependent, that means what? It means that you can be considered a head of household. By the way, I just want to quickly mention that when we say dependents, we always talked about a qualified dependent because of the rules that I just gave you. The IRS has strict rules to actually ascertain whether or not the dependents that you have listed on your tax returns can actually be considered qualified dependent or not. The question is, are there special rules for claiming a child as a dependent? By the way, I want to quickly remind everybody of today's topic. We're having a conversation around whether or not you should file a tax return for your dependent. So let me just break it down for you. So when you are claiming a dependent who is a child, there are further requirements. So the child has to have lived with you for at least half of the year. So the notion of 50% is always coming back, always recurrent throughout this discussion about dependents versus head of households. Okay, the child must not have provided more than half of her own support for the year. Earlier, I was just giving you the example of your daughter who actually provided more than 50% of her own support. This actually disqualifies her in terms of being your dependent, and the child has to be treated. Okay. Actually, not to be treated. The child has to be related to you as a son, daughter, stepchild, foster child, brother, sister, stepbrother, stepsister, or a descendant of any of those. Okay, and the child must be 18 or younger at the end of the year, or under 24 if a student. To be a student, a child must have attended school full-time during the last at least 5 months of the year. The 5 months don't have to be in a row though. And the child must be younger than you, your spouse, if married filing jointly, unless the child is actually disabled. So it's very important. And can you claim older relatives or unrelated persons as dependents on your tax returns? Yes, provided they meet the following requirements. So the person cannot be a qualifying dependent of another person. In other words, you cannot claim the person if someone else already has. And the person must be either related to you or must have lived with you all year as a member of your household. The person's gross income for the year must be less than $4,300. So those are really important things you need to remember. You must provide more than half of the person's total support for the year. Going back to what I said, it's all about the percentage. It's all about the threshold that you need to follow when making sure that people are just not charging you. I mean, you're not really not charging. You're not actually considering somebody to be your dependent if you have not provided for them for at least 50% of the time. So this is important. 50%. Now let's talk about another interesting question. Could my adult dependents still be required to file a tax return? Yes, your adult dependent may still need to file a tax return in certain situations. Okay, now before I actually give you those situations, please make sure that whatever, again, going back to what I said about if you provide support for someone, please make sure you keep receipts, that you actually, either the receipt can be electronic or online, depending on what you have. But it's really important because if the IRS were to dig a little deeper, into your tax return, they will ask for receipts and documents. So please make sure that you have everything ready. Another thing I want to say here is that you want to count the notion of having a dependent. It's not a permanent notion. you can actually take care of someone this year, and next year they're no longer with you, especially with young people. But so if you, and this applies also for your adult dependents, so just make sure that that their situation has not changed enough so that they don't qualify anymore as your qualifying dependent. So let me talk to you now about the scenarios under which your adult dependent can be required to file a tax return. If your single dependent was under age 65 and not blind this year, they must file a tax return if they had unearned income more than 1,100, earned income more than 14,000, and gross income more than the larger of 1,100, and earned income of up to 14,000 plus 350. If your single dependent was blind or age 65, they must file a tax return if they had unearned income of more than 2,800, earned income of more than 14 to 15,000, gross income more than the larger of 2,800, and earned income up to 12,200 plus 2,050. If your single dependent was age 65 and blind, they must file a tax return if they had unearned income more than 4,500, earned income more than 16,000, gross income more than the larger of 4,500, and earned income up to 12,200 plus 3,750. So there are some calculations. If you need more information about this, please let us know in the comment section. We'll certainly get back to you. We'll certainly answer you specifically based on your specific situation. One thing I want to say here is that please always seek help if needed. See, the whole thing here is that a lot of people are just saying, hey, listen, yeah, I could do this myself, whatever. But if you have a complicated tax return, it's always better to seek help, okay? And when we talk about seeking help, please don't just go and hire anybody. Because if you have, if we're talking about big numbers here, you want to actually hire someone who can actually help you optimize your taxes. The thing is, when we talk about seeking help, most people think about, well, evading taxes. When you hire a CPA, when you hire an enrolled agent, when you hire, let's say, you hire a tax attorney, people think that you don't have to be rich, or you don't have to have a super complicated tax return. It's just that sometimes if you just need guidance, it's just better, okay? Don't hire anybody though. You want people who have credentials, okay? You want to get a referral if possible. You want to interview candidates, okay? You want to ask them how long they have been doing what they are doing. And it's really important to also make sure that you watch for the red flags. If somebody is if somebody has a record with the IRS, you don't want that anyway. You also want to make sure that you want to mention any special circumstances to the tax preparer, especially if you have multiple dependents, okay? And you want to pick a preparer who really understands the kind of situation you currently have. And even better, somebody who has dealt with this issue in the past, or is still dealing with this issue right now as we speak. So this will really help you a lot, really sort of contextualize your situation and improve your chances of filing an accurate tax return. One thing I want to say also is that you have to constantly make sure that you keep in contact with the tax preparer, so that whenever he or she does is in accord, is in synergy with what you want. And one thing I want to say also is that you need to make sure that you are able to differentiate between a tax preparer and tax software. Maybe it's just a lot better to use tax software. If your situation is not too complicated and you don't need tax advice, well, you can just use tax software. I mean, they are cheaper, they are quicker, and you actually get your taxes, you actually get your refund real quick. So this is really, I'm just giving you options to explore. You never know. So it's all about making sure that you put all your eggs in different baskets and make sure that you do everything possible to file your tax return, even if you have a dependent, and get refunded as soon as possible. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I will just answer the question, do I have to file a tax return for my dependent? And the quick answer is yes, and the long answer is also yes. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. In today's conversation, I talked to you about a lot of things, but please, if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you need more information, please put them in the comment section. We'll certainly get back to you. Until next time, please remember, stay marvelous.